It's 5 o'clock in London, it's midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 4 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID livestream, Series 29, Episode number 3, that is in the aggregate, Episode 171, starts here. Over at the London Stock Exchange Group, LSEG have been angered by a data sell-side consultancy hatchet job, but we worry why are so few parishioners eager to defend the exchange world? Thank you, Mark Shadle, for championing the dominant modern e-commerce model. Mark, of course, a great alumnus of the IPO-VID canon. Over at Deutsche Börse and indeed over at Euronext, we've got a very interesting concept. Is the CSD, the Securities Depository Settlement great game finally afoot? Is Euroclear in play? Stefan Bujna of Euronext has made an ambition clear. Does that endanger the 7 tiers of Belgian middle management? Great competition to DB1 may be looming via a Euronext Euroclear combine. Great news, meanwhile, from the USA. The Trump administration has confirmed 2 great exchange practitioners. Howard Lutnick is a dedicated trade commerce secretary, while Kelly Loeffler is the inspired choice for the Small Business Administration. At the same time, in the US, well, next stop, Fort Knox. Doge is wondering if all the government math is so dire. Is that gold really in the big storage warehouse? Look out, ladies and gentlemen, there's an audit incoming to Fort Knox. And finally, Germany has had a general election. Apparently it's been won by the CDU, but with the traditional 2 parties on the left and right, not 45% compared to 85% way back when. Germany was the coming man of Europe. Perhaps the EU and Germany now need to face up to a new reality, but that's proving difficult after the lost EU generation. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is a fabulous one, a legend in the world of economics, Sir Paul Collier. Our topic today, well, amongst others, his 2 most recent brilliant books, Left Behind and The Future of Capitalism. If you are not already aware of his incredible legacy, Sir Paul Collier is a preeminent global development economist who is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Gosh, this promises, ladies and gentlemen, to be a fascinating discussion as we roam around the world looking for development optimism. And let's get stuck in. Sir Paul, welcome to IPO-VID. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you, Patrick. I'm here in Oxford, but I'm very excited because suddenly a great wall of complacency has broken. We've got a disruptor in play, and boy, is he disrupting.
Yes, and it's also very interesting because boy, is he disrupting. And I mean, as I said in my initial remarks, it's very interesting, though, because he's got some very, very execution-focused people. I mean, the 2 I just mentioned, who you may or may not be terribly au fait with, I mean, I would immediately say that Howard Lutnick is probably not the man you would most like to have a beer with under any category, but as the person to put in charge as Trade Secretary to unify and represent the United States of America, he is incredible. And Kelly Loeffler is one of the best executors I have ever had the joy of working with. And she really is phenomenal. She had a brief spell in the Senate. And that's what really makes it interesting, because disruption's one thing, but having the talent pool to carry through is quite another. And we've seen that so many times when people are disrupting society, rightly or wrongly.
I think Scott Bessant is a really sound appointment, clever appointment in finance. Really, he comes from the stable of George Soros, which was a very clever stable. George made $30 billion. Which is no mean feat. I know George very well, so I understand the strategy that he adopted, and I think Bessant is a very wise choice.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think Besant, and they're incredibly good at holistic thinking. And that's something I think we have not necessarily been blessed with in a lot of level appointments the world over in recent decades.
I also, he's got a very interesting vice president, J.D. Vance.
Yes.
Who comes from a very much not a financial tradition. And that's what makes the regime so unpredictable. I think that's actually part of President Trump's strategy, is to be sufficiently unpredictable that that further disrupts, it stirs the pot. And then he's very quick to see what the opportunities are once the pot is stirred and sort of leap on them. That I think is it's more than just disruption.
Yeah.
It's sort of deliberate creating of uncertainties. I see uncertainty as a big opportunity for the firms and countries that use that uncertainty to prepare for how do you cope with an uncertain future. That's what a lot of my work is about, is responding to uncertainty. Most countries have been very bad at that, including, unfortunately, my own. But they have to learn fast.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because also we then, see how incredible in the arc of some economies that have developed incredibly, many that have developed incredibly have had no core advantage. I mean, if you look at somewhere like, say, Singapore and compare that to, say, many oil-rich or gas-rich or mineral-rich nations, I mean, Singapore still doesn't even have enough water to actually provide for itself over the medium term, and yet it's become pretty much the richest state per head of population.
Patrick, I wasn't expecting you to look as far as Singapore. Why don't you look to your origins, Ireland? There was Ireland in the 1950s, the poorest country in Western Europe.
Yep.
And now it's just about the richest. And that transformation was based on no natural advantages, but they were brilliant to see that they had one big opportunity that was there precisely because they got a long past of failure. Because of failure, people had emigrated to America. There are now approximately 40 million Americans who trace their origins to Ireland. And the Irish government realized, gosh, that's a huge opportunity to tap into. And they did it brilliantly. A vast diaspora, such as Ireland had, because of past failure, becomes a huge opportunity for the future. And that was the transformational process that Ireland mastered. Lots of other countries with dismal pasts can master the same trick.
Yes, and I completely agree with you. And I mean, it is incredible for me because I can remember my own childhood going from Belfast, which was a command economy run by Britain, insofar as it was 57%, I think, of the economy was effectively government spending, but at least we were maintaining a standard of living. But when we got to Dublin, I mean, the profound poverty in the downtown was incredible. In fact, about 15 years ago, I got invited to go to your conference and I promptly got lost trying to walk around Dublin because the areas were so gentrified that I remembered with terror as from a child. I couldn't believe that they were now so pretty, and I got completely lost trying to wander to Dublin Castle. And it's wonderful. It's absolutely fantastic. And it really, really is. It's an incredible achievement and it's wonderful to see. So tell me, I mean, what got you interested in the idea of development economics?
Well, because I'm a little bit like J.D. Vance. I was a poor boy from a poor city in the north of England, Sheffield, and both my parents had left school when they were 12. So I was the first kid in our family to get an education beyond the most rudimentary. And I was damn lucky. So I by a fluke, there was an exam at the time called the 11 Plus, which you took when you were 11 years old, and I passed for the best school in Sheffield, which was itself very unexpected, and it was a good school. It was a free school, so my parents didn't have to pay anything. Good job, they didn't have any money, but from there, I ended up at Oxford as an undergraduate, and then I just rose by the usual process of managing to be a bit smarter than most people, and so I ended up rising through the various ranks of Oxford academic life, from being an undergraduate to a graduate to a postdoc to an economics don, and eventually to a professor and head of a research department. And then Harvard offered me a chair. Then Sciences Po in Paris offered me a chair. Then the World Bank made me the director of its research department, and so on and so forth. So the first steps were the hardest. The first steps are always the hardest, because the first steps, you don't believe in your own abilities. After a while, you get overconfident in your abilities. And I don't know where J.D. Vance is in that spectrum. I know where I have been. I've been from astonished that I was being offered all these positions, then thinking, well, it must be because I was really clever, and then realizing that, well, there were thousands of people like me who were just as clever, but hadn't been fortunate, hadn't had the luck of the draw. And so that way you finally learn a bit of modesty and realize that you've just been damn lucky. And so that's my story. Where Vance is in that story, I don't know, but he's certainly, I hope he realizes it's not all the ability of J.D. Vance. It's he's been lucky as well.
Yes, he's been lucky as well. But at the same time, I think you also mentioned the fact that you have to make the most of the opportunities you're given. And certainly, I mean, it must have been an incredible experience for you going to Oxford after Sheffield. And certainly, I'm sure it was quite a culture shock, something that took you a while to get used to as you were going along. And I'm curious, actually, because Jeff Sprecher, who created the exchange group Intercontinental, bought the New York Stock Exchange. And I asked him one day, I said, I sincerely hope when you walk into the New York Stock Exchange every day, it always really, really excites you. And he said, trust me, when I walk into the New York Stock Exchange, I'm the happiest man in the world. It's the most incredible feeling to walk into this building. And I sincerely hope you feel the same way about one of the greatest seats of learning in the world, Oxford University.
I do indeed. It's a huge privilege. And this is a wonderful building. It's like a giant glass wedding cake. It cost a ton, but it's a beautiful piece of architecture which lifts the spirits daily. Architecture does matter. And so inspiring architecture, and this is very clever because it's designed so that we can bump into each other, the different staff in the school. We can bump into each other randomly, and a lot of research has shown that the random conversations are very good at sort of cross-fertilizing ideas. People who wouldn't normally plan to sit down and have a coffee discover by a random conversation that they've got something to talk about. And there's one study of one of the most tech advanced companies in the world, Google, there was a study of what best predicts what new ideas come out of Google. And what was the result? It showed it depends on who happens to sit next to somebody else. Because sitting next to each other, you got talking, and then you discovered you'd got different skills, and by talking together, you came up with an idea. So even Google, where we're all taught to, you just rely on online communication, physical interaction is really quite a good idea.
And that's why, of course, so many people such as Jamie Dimon are getting very upset about work from home, because actually it's work by the water cooler that starts to become vitally important, because little did we realize that the watering hole, which was so important when we were taking our animals there 200, 500, 1,000 years ago, is even more vital today when we're just watering ourselves in the office because it cross-fertilizes ideas.
Completely right. And so I think Jamie Dimon is quite right to want people back in that office. Not only do we get the interactions daily, but how on earth are young guys got to pick up the experience of older guys if they're not in the office?
Absolutely. I quite agree. So tell us, what got you into specifically looking at development economics?
I was part of a very naive generation. I was the generation of 1968, which was a grandiose generation. We thought that we'd just learned all this fancy social science. Social science has moved out of the dark ages into sort of serious academic research, economics and so forth. Economics was sort of the queen of the social sciences. And we thought that must be really useful. We exaggerated the use it could be put to. And so we had a very inflated view of what public policy, informed by all this economics, could do. And so we thought we could save the world and save the poor countries with all this applied economics. So that's why I went into public policy, working on the poorest countries to try and save them. This is a view I now hold with complete and utter contempt all the way along the line. Every idea that I stated there, I think is wrong. But it took me a long time to learn out why.
And so, that brings us, we'll take a leap to the more recent times. You're very interested in this whole concept, and you've written a wonderful book, Left Behind, trying to talk about that bottom billion of people in the world. And obviously, it's very difficult to say in a couple of sentences, but what are the things that we can best do, or what are the things that those people can best do to advance themselves at this juncture?
Yeah, so left behind places start to feel demoralized. They start to blame themselves for their fate. They look and they see other places are not left behind. Why are they left behind? They start to, worst of all, when they blame each other. Workers blame business blames the local government blames everybody but itself. And that blame game is really deeply damaging. So how do you get out of it? First, you face reality and you say, unless we come together and look at the resources of our place, just as Ireland looked at its resources and thought, what can we turn to advantage here? And Ireland saw having a big diaspora could be turned to a huge advantage. And then they came up with a very clever strategy. South Yorkshire, where I'm from, is now the poorest region in England. It needs to come together and say, what are the advantages of South Yorkshire? It's got a lot of advantages. It was a very inventive place. The first factory on Earth is 10 miles from where I was born. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Center. These are very innovative people in the past. The whole Bessemer steel process was invented in Sheffield. So we need to say, recover some confidence, some pride in that past achievement, and say we're not nostalgic to go backwards. We're not trying to recreate the past, but what now are the opportunities we've got? Well, Sheffield's got two superb universities. One of the top 100 research universities in the world, and so it's absolutely at the frontier in some subjects, especially engineering. So anything that needs engineering, that's really valuable for. A few years ago, Sheffield University seeded a new cluster of firms called the Advanced Engineering Manufacturing Centre. It's got some very fancy firms like McLaren, the Formula One racing car group, and they created this business park. It's already full. It's already completely full after only 8 years of doing it. Now, the triumph is that the firms in that cluster are really successful, thriving. And the tragedy is that they can't expand anywhere else because this was a little area and there's nowhere to expand anywhere near it. And that's a tragedy of low expectations, of thinking this couldn't work very well. And so not thinking in advance and saying, let's make this at scale. So that's an example of what a place can do. Come together, see your advantages. In that case, let's use our top university, and then have the confidence to support a bold strategy that gradually restores the place.
And it's interesting because optimism plays such a role in development. And if you look at the incredible optimism of the Yorkshire mill owners and factory manufacturers of the 19th century, they were incredible. I mean, they were social pioneers. Someone like Titus Salt, who I know you've talked about in the past. I mean, an incredible man who became, I mean, he was a one-man, almost multi-dimensional being. He had so many roles, but he did so much. And he was just one of a cluster of different eminent Yorkshiremen who were all able to achieve incredible things before we even started talking about the cricket team that wouldn't accept anybody who wasn't born in Yorkshire.
Well, my grandmother's maiden name was Salt, and my father always told me we are descended from Sir Titus Salt. So, maybe there's a gene at work somewhere in my brain that is Sir Titus. But I, as you say, I couldn't have a better ancestor if he is an ancestor, because he was phenomenal in being socially responsible capitalism. So he was a major capitalist. He was the biggest fish in the pond in Bradford. He became mayor. He became the local MP. He was the biggest employer. But he saw that his workers needed something better than what they got. And in 1849, cholera struck Bradford. And of course, nobody knew what caused it, but his workers were dying. And he had to work on some hypothesis of what could be causing it and what would make it better. And thank goodness, his idea was, let's build a new town which is cleaner, which has got fresh air. And that was close enough to the truth about the germ theory of disease, which wasn't around at the time. It was good enough that it worked. And so Saltaire his town, became a very good place to live. And so that was socially responsible capitalism, which thought positively about how can we use our wealth not only to make money for ourselves, but how can we use that money to make a better life for the people for whom we're responsible, namely our own employees.
And that brings us very, very elegantly then to discussing another of your major books in recent years, because you wrote a very, very elegant tome, The Future of Capitalism. I mean, that's something, the future of capitalism is much discussed. Tell us a little bit about your book with the subtitle Facing the New Anxieties.
Yeah, so it's called Facing the New Anxieties. I'll show you the British edition, which indeed has two faces on it, both looking anxious. This one is me, and this one is my son, Alex. So it was painted by my eldest son, Daniel, so it was very much a family production. But what was the future of capitalism and the new anxieties saying? It was saying that a lot of young people are worried about their future. And if we look at the survey evidence, especially across Europe, but also in America, many young people, in fact, in Europe, a majority of young people expect their future lives to be worse than their parents. Now, that's incredible. Incredible. It's a disgrace that people are so lacking in optimism, because, of course, modern technology is moving so fast now that we should be able to harness all that new technology for very much better lives. And for some people, it will be. But for these young people, they're very fearful. So what is the future of capitalism talking about? It's talking about two possible forms of capitalism, and by extension, two possible forms of firms, because the lifeblood of capitalism is firms, businesses. And one style of business is very much a top-down, I'm the genius, I know best, you do what I tell you. And that produces, I think, quite an ugly form of capitalism. The other form of capitalism is one sort that Titus Salt did, where it's a more responsible capitalism. It says, yes, I've made my money, but I want this to work for others as well. And we get some very good firms that succeed by that. My friend and colleague, John Kay, who's the top business economist in Europe, you should get him on the show, he gives the example of the struggle between Toyota and General Motors in the 1960s and 70s. And Toyota had no technological advantage over General Motors. General Motors was a much bigger firm, but we know who won that struggle. It went on for a long time because General Motors started as the most profitable firm that there'd ever been on earth. And it ended in 2009. And you'll remember what happened in 2009. GM went bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt why it went bankrupt. It was killed by competition from Toyota. Now, what did Toyota do? What was the secret sauce that Toyota had and that General Motors couldn't manage? And it was trusting their workforce. The head, the chief executive of Toyota dressed like the workers. They met together in the morning. They sang the company song together. And the message to Toyota workers was, it's in everybody's interest if we break into the American market. It will solidify our jobs, and there'll be expansion and promotions and stuff. But in order to do it, you, an ordinary worker on the production line, have to work in the interest of the firm. And here's our one advantage we can have. We can produce fault-free cars. In order to produce a fault-free car, we need you on the production line to spot a fault at source. Here's a new robot we've got. It's not quite tuned in right, so it's scratching the cars as they go by. You tell us now, fast. The sooner we spot that fault, the better. Faults are treasures became the motto. And to enable it, they hung cords all the way along the production line. You pull a cord, the entire production line stops. Is that expensive to stop the whole production line? $10,000 a minute. So you've got to trust your workers a lot to do that. If one worker says, "Oh, I want to smoke. I'm fed up. I got a headache. I just want a break," pull the cord. $10,000 a minute of damage. So you've got to have a workforce which is completely dedicated. And to enforce that, it wasn't done by penalties. It was done by creating a thing called quality circles, little teams. So 5 guys on the production line working next to each other, they'd become a quality circle. Of course, it wasn't a circle, it was a line. But they were told, you 5 are jointly and individually responsible for policing this line. You spot a fault, you pull the cord. You miss a fault, and we pick it up at the end. We'll trace it back to you having failed the company and failed each other and failed other people on the line. And so that was the spirit which enabled Toyota to bankrupt General Motors. When General Motors finally understood it, they tried to replicate, and they couldn't, because everybody was on it. There was a Taylor model of the labor force. Taylor was the great inventor of paying bonuses and piece rates and so on, that sort of thing, which was appropriate when Taylor was first working and you got an industrial workforce that was just new to industry. But it's a lousy model for a more advanced society. And trying to run a society like America or Europe with a Taylor model of the labor market just obliterates trust and team spirit and all the things that enable a firm to succeed. So that's the story of how Toyota defeated General Motors, and it's a larger story of the difference between a healthy capitalism that really dramatically drives the whole society and an unhealthy society, which, sure, it produces some billionaires, but it produces a very dissatisfied workforce and a lot of misery.
And it's very interesting, though, because when we look at the development of successful economies, there does seem to be a distribution of both opportunity and wealth. And if we look at the companies or the countries that are particularly stagnant, they do seem to have a sort of permanent oligarchy that makes it very, very difficult for them to move forward. And I mean, one could possibly say, well, as a stagnant oligarchy, perhaps you have some Mediterranean nations, let's put it that way. Let's be slightly oblique. But certainly it's very interesting how the empowerment of people is vitally important to achieve development.
Completely. You talk about some Mediterranean nations, but let me be bold here. I think when a society really crashes, as I'll point out, one Mediterranean nation did, once the society really crashes, that's a wake-up call. Now, either the society just falls apart becomes the next Argentina, which for 120 years had the wrong idea in its head that everybody was to blame except the Argentinians for the decline in their economy. And so in 1900, it was about the fifth richest economy on earth. By 2020, it was on the bottom edge of the G20. An embarrassment to the rest of the G20. And then in Argentina, you got this crisis point where a disruptor emerged. And whether he'll be a successful disruptor, it's too early to say. But I think the same thing we can see in Greece, where Greece really crashed. And I would say that Greece is now really quite an interesting place, because I think it did force the Greeks to face reality, to come together. And so they're much bolder society of trying to rebuild than the more successful Mediterranean countries, which are still locked into complacency. So I don't know whether Greece is what you had in mind as a disaster.
That's actually a great point about Greece. 2 points, because I think Greece was locked into a kind of oligopoly. The wealth, there was a certain cadre of, I think 12, 15, 20 families that held a huge amount of wealth. The economy detonated in the course of 2008. And yet what we've seen since then has been some very, very lateral solutions to try and get the economy going again. And while it's been very painful, it is changing. And it's so fascinating, but it is such a shame that it seems to me that most countries, to get going again, need that sort of short, sharp shock, to use a statement from a different realm, in order to get going. Because actually, even in Ireland, it was very much as a result of a hideous 1970s that only further perpetuated the cycle of poverty that got the Irish economic miracle going. And to be fair, the European Union, the EEC at the time, and the EC actually provided a lot of essential seed fund to make the infrastructure better. I'm curious, what do you think is the importance of overseas funding in order to help developing economies develop?
I think there's... If you're in a poor region in a rich country, you're lucky because that rich country can do something about you. If you're a poor country, you don't have that luxury. You're a sovereign country and your debt will look pretty bad. So for the poor countries, some sort of external funding is useful. I'm not fixated on aid. I think aid is more like sort of sticking plaster. It's a solution of the past. But I think there are some public agencies. The World Bank has IFC, International Finance Corporation. I convene about 30 of them each year in Oxford. And those development finance institutions, as they're called, have a really important role in financing the firms and the infrastructure that get something going in a country. You can't do it without some money coming, and you can't expect foreign direct investment to rush into a place that's still half dead. It's not a place of opportunity. And so public investment there has to lead in private investment, and the public investment has to come from these international public agencies. They're hyper cautious at the moment, I have to say. They don't have any sense of a bold vision of how a poor country can transform itself, like Ireland did. as you say, Ireland was lucky that it was able to draw on the deep pockets of Europe because it had the very good sense to join the European community. And the European community had these deep-pocketed institutions like the European Investment Bank, which could raise public money and invest in the essential infrastructure which helped to get Ireland lifted up.
And that, therefore, I suppose, raises the secondary question of, there is an issue with infrastructure. What about the core of civilization, the legal system? Is there something that works better for developing your economy in terms of having a legal underpinning?
The phrase the rule of law is a bit too grandiose for my taste, to be honest. Let's get to something that's a bit humbler than that and say, what sort of rights does an investor really need, a foreign investor need, in order to contemplate investing in a country? And I think what they need is a level playing field. They need some ability to appeal to a court which has got a power enough to enforce basic rights of property. And basic rights of not being put at disadvantage by skewed government policies. So that's the sort of thing which a wise government that desperately needs to attract foreign direct investment should be prepared to do. It should be prepared to, as it were, tie its hands and say, here's a court that we recognize that you can trust, and we will abide by that court. That's the sort of thing that helps a wise government. That differentiates a wise government from a foolish one. The foolish government says, no, we're sovereign, we're not prepared to bind our hands. And of course, that then provides inadvertently a signal that you can't trust this government. So, rule of law is to my mind a bit too big a phrase, but getting practical to think, what are the exact rights that a firm needs before it can safely go into a country? They don't need a guarantee that the market will always be robust. This is the difference between East Asian investors in Africa and European investors in Africa. Because the Europeans have been around for a long time, they say, oh, I know this place. I know it's always been hopeless. It always will be hopeless. Whereas East Asian investors go into Africa and look and say, we recognize this. It's sort of where we were 40 years ago. And of course, the future will be bouncy, but this place is heading up. If only because of its demography. It's got loads of bright young kids. So take a country like Ethiopia or Kenya, where the future's very much on their side. They've got bright young kids, whereas in East Asia, one of the things they've really messed up is their demography. So Japan, South Korea, they're really running out of young people. They've got brilliant firms, but no young people to work in them. So they're going to have to move to the places where the young people are. And so they're now looking at Kenya very closely because it does have quite a tradition of very innovative young people. You know, you've got the first unicorns coming out of Kenya. You've got ambitious young people, very excited by IT technology. You know, when Google came to Kenya, it didn't come to teach the Kenyans. It came to learn what the latest innovations in IT were. So there are places like, as I say, Kenya's interesting in IT. Ethiopia, a much bigger economy, much bigger society, has had fast growth for 20 years, very fast growth. And then it got into a rocky spell of internal conflict, bit of civil war. As the East Asians look at that and say, yeah, it's a bouncy ride, but really Ethiopia's got so much potential that we're going to stick with this for the long term. Whereas the Europeans were saying, oh, it's much too scary. So the ability to see a future and then take a risk. You build a portfolio. I mean, it's like venture capital. You protect yourself by looking to 5 or 6 places, of which one will go bust, one will do exceptionally well, and 2 more will be good enough that you get back your money 3 times over. And that sort of approach to investing in the frontier and emerging economies of Africa and for that matter Central Asia, that's the approach that I think will be successful. I think it'd actually be more successful than going into either the rather toppy investments in the US. I could be wrong there, but I think the market's awfully high. So how much potential there is for further up, I don't know. Whereas the other extreme, Europe, as you were suggesting, still looks rather stale, except for the countries that have crashed and have got reborn, Ireland on the one hand, and now Greece on the other. So
yes,
that's
sorry,
what
go
I
ahead.
get excited about.
Well, it's very interesting. And actually, to go to a comment we had, which has been, I'm sorry, I didn't reply to it earlier. Thank you very much, Woman on It. Good evening, Patrick and Sir Paul Collier. It's great to see another episode of IPO-VID. But very quickly, Woman on It moved on to, can't wait for this discussion, as Google AI, when asked, what is the future of capitalism with Donald Trump, answers unsafe content. And she goes on to say, civic integrity, it's great to be a human. Well, there are 2 fascinating lessons in there. I mean, one is when we look at this whole AI boom, and you mentioned the issue of the US technology bubble. It's fascinating how when you put a huge wall of talent, as the Chinese did recently, and throw that at a problem, suddenly you can get a very, very different solution. And I'm not saying DeepSeek is right and OpenAI is wrong, but it's intriguing how each can manage to come up with remarkably similar results while using very, very different approaches to high technology.
Absolutely. And I think that's really the lesson of sort of unpredictability and uncertainty. But you've got to learn to live with uncertainty. And there are, let's just explore that idea for a little bit, that there are really 2 complementary approaches to living with uncertainty. So one is to learn rapidly by just trying to do experiments in parallel. And that's the example of diversifying your portfolio. Learn what seems to be working now. The other is to try and build in resilience and robustness, so that even if you get very stormy weather or a major upset, you're protected because you've shock-proofed your portfolio. And, let's get a practical example of that. Mm-hmm. So, learning from others, the diversified approach we've sort of explored, that's easy to understand. Let's have a look at resilience and robustness. So I use the analogy of 2 sailing dinghies. and one of the sailing dinghies is gusty wind and it capsizes. The other sailing dinghy isn't hit by such a strong wind. It bends over like that. The sail goes like that. The crew's been trained for resilience. Resilience says if the sail's going that way, you lean out that way. If you sailed a sailing dinghy, you know that's what you've got to do. Right? And so getting a skilled team that has that skill to lean and offset the disturbed weather, that's building in resilience. Building in robustness is, oh dear, the dinghy's capsized. What do we do now? Well, if you've ever gone dinghy sailing, you know that nearly all your training is how to flip back upright an upside down dinghy. That's a skill that if you've not taught it, if you've not learned it, you don't know it. So preparing your firm, your team in the firm to say, if this thing capsizes, what is plan B? Plan B is the strategy for robustness. And so far too many firms don't have a genuine plan B. They plan on what they think is a central scenario. Very often it's the first best scenario is, here's the plan if everything works. What matters is the plan B when everything doesn't work and you find yourself upside down, drifting back in the current.
And indeed, also the problem you find when you're being out-evolved. I mean, I think the Clayton Christensen book, The Innovator's Dilemma, surmised that beautifully, where companies would actually go out of their way to essentially try and ignore the product that was going to take their market, even when they'd invented it themselves.
Completely. This is the attempt to, and it's psychologically very common. You want to try and think that what you're planning, which is actually a best case scenario, is the most likely outcome, and so you don't need to worry about anything else, or you worry a little bit. But having a really solid plan B. And plan B is all too likely to happen. So you need that. And is it a credible plan B? Your firm is only as strong as the credibility to investors of its plan B.
That's a very, very powerful statement altogether. And I think that also holds a huge amount for the development economics of the world. So let me ask you one question. I mean, as you look at the world today, are you spotting any countries that are doing their development economics particularly well and you see as exciting prospects for the future?
Well, I think there are about 5 or 6 in Africa. So let me look at 1 or 2 of them. I think in Francophone Africa, the most exciting prospect is Côte d'Ivoire, in English, the Ivory Coast. It's quite a big economy by African standards. It's got quite a good leader, and his only problem is his age. He's just in his 80s, but there's a very, very good younger guy in the wings, you'll have heard of, Tijani Thiam, who was the chief executive of the Norwich Union, then the chief executive of Credit Suisse. He's, when he moved from Norwich Union to Credit Suisse, the share price of Credit Suisse went up a lot. The share price of Norwich Union went down. So the investor community knew this was a good guy. He's from the Côte d'Ivoire. I happen to know him. I know he's a really good guy. He could do for his country just the sort of things he's done for firms. And so it's a very exciting prospect. Whether he succeeds at the next election in about a year, I don't know, but he'll succeed at some stage. And that's the future. There's societies like that attracting back. He's effectively now diaspora, but he's attracting back. If the country is attracting back its really capable people, that's hugely exciting. If we move to Eastern Africa, I think the really exciting place, as I've suggested, is Ethiopia. A big society, over 100 million people, that is enormously strategically well located. It's now just built a Chinese-built railway to the coast, and it's a very, very exciting place with a lot of capability. Quite a good leader, I think, who's been bold and has been prepared to take tough actions, that have sacrificed some popularity in order to build a stronger future. So, if we take Cote d'Ivoire in the west, in the east, either Kenya or Ethiopia, and then in southern Africa, the small country that's been hugely successful is Botswana. Botswana, which on independence was just about the poorest country in the world, and is now the most prosperous country per capita in the whole of Africa. So that became a really fast-growing country on the back of very well-used diamonds. It wasn't the diamonds themselves; it was the use that they put to it, put to the money. A larger society that could be the next Botswana is Zambia. The good economic leader, President Hichilema, who's a businessman. He's broken the pattern of tribal politics. He's from a very small tribe, and he got the youth vote. Attracting the youth vote for a businessman that threw out the previous pretty corrupt old guard guy. So Zambia's a 20 million plus population. It's got huge variety of natural resources, and it's got a pretty well-educated labor force, and it's always been peaceful. So it's an unusual case where it's for a long time been a functioning democracy, and it's been peaceful. So the downside in Zambia isn't that big, and there's a very big upside if it makes it. So I would go for, those 3 or 4. And are they all going to turn right? I hope so. But suppose 2 of them turn right and 2 just teeter along. They won't get any worse than they are now. So if 2 of them go right, you'll be one of the few investors in at the ground floor. Mm-hmm. In at the ground floor, you go from 2 to 10, and that's a nice ride to have.
An absolutely fabulous ride to have. And we've been talking today about Left Behind and the Future of Capitalism, 2 of your great books amongst your canon. So Paul Collier, it leaves me only to ask you the final question. Where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
I think that there'll be many extensions of ChatGPT, many. They'll be so competitive that they'll be cheap. So I rather think the money won't be in spotting the next super IT thing. It'll be all the somewhat more traditional places that find this use of knowledge super powerful, and they are more traditional economy, which gets a huge boost from all this cheap use of knowledge, which is effectively what AI is. It's much better use of our brain power. Our brain power can concentrate on the bits that we don't understand, that you need human judgment for, and the bog standard stuff will all be done by AI. So that's an exciting future.
What an exciting future indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, the lesson is, of course, that we have to learn to live with uncertainty and learn to profit from it. Just one of the many words of wisdom that we've heard today from Sir Paul Collier. It has been a joy to have you on the show, Sir Paul. Thank you very, very much for sharing your time with us. Indeed, thank you also to Ulf Axman, noting thanks for a very most interesting conversation with Sir Paul. I wholeheartedly agree. It's been a joy to have you on this show. We wish you all the very, very best, because truly, the more we can grow that pie, the wealthier we can all be on this wonderful planet. And whether it's the Zambians giving us the growth or the Kenyans or whoever it may be, we wish everyone well as they pursue a better life, a better future, and a better opportunity for their population pyramid rather. My name is Patrick L. Young. I want to say thank you very, very much to our fabulous team today. Thank you to Fernando, Natalie, and Marianne for doing a great job in production. Thank you, Woman On It, for your question. Thank you, Ulf Axman, for your comment. Thank you very much, Sir Paul, for adding such an interesting conversation topic to the cornucopia, the portfolio that has been IPO-VID in 170-something episodes to date. And let me say, next week, we can look forward to an interesting episode. It's going to be me. It's a pre-recorded special episode because I'm traveling. I'll be giving you my keynote speech from Nairobi, discussing a new world order. And indeed, it wouldn't be too much to say that it actually hits upon some of the issues that Sir Paul has very appositely raised today during the course of this show. My name is Patrick L. Young. As ever, we'll continue going about the production of the newsletter of the World of the Bourse Business, Exchange Invest Daily, and also building the marketplaces of the future as and when time and opportunity permits. I want to say thank you very, very much once again, Sir Paul, for making this a fantastic show. Thank you, production team, and I wish you all a great week in life and markets.